Hello and welcome everyone to our February webinar, Building a River's Identity to Attract New Users and Advocates. I'm really excited that you were all able to join us this afternoon, so thank you for making time in your day. My name is Faye Augustin and I'm the Intermountain West Blue Trails Manager for American Rivers, and I will be moderating our webinar today. Just a couple of quick follow-up pre-notes on from me before we jump into the webinar. If you have any issues with technical support and your connection is lost, please log in again using the unique web link and passcode that was provided to you when you registered with GoToWebinar. And additionally, as always, this webinar is being recorded and will be available at bluetrailsguide.org/webinars by next Monday, February 22nd. And you can also always view past webinars there as well. So if you've ever missed other webinars, please feel free to view those there. We try to make this webinar as interactive as possible, so we really appreciate and encourage any asking of questions or comments that you might have throughout the webinar. You're able to submit a question or, again, a comment at any time via the question box on your screen, the GoToWebinar side panel. Feel free to ask at any time during the webinar, and we'll leave a short period of time, about 5 to 7 minutes, for questions and answers at the end of the webinar. And again, this webinar will be available and recorded at bluetrailsguide.org. And this is the blog version by February 22nd. So without further ado, let's jump into our webinar for this month. I am very pleased to welcome our panelist, Mimi Wagner. Mimi is an associate professor of landscape architecture at Iowa State University's College of Design. She's extensively researched and written about water trails in Iowa, focused specifically on social relationships with the landscape. Along with the DNR staff in Iowa, Mimi has co-authored 2 water trail publications, Developing Water Trails in Iowa and Iowa Water Trails, Connecting People with Water and Resources. Her current research is focused on developing water trail plans for Iowa rivers that synthesize a broad range of data, generate a vision for the future, and activate its people. So with that, I'm very pleased and honored to welcome Mimi Wagner. Mimi, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Faye. As Faye indicated, I'm both a practicing landscape architect as well as an academic researcher. And water, specifically rivers, has been the primary focus of my research and practice since about 2008. Today, I'm going to share recent work from the Iowa Water Trails program. We'll be looking at segments of 3 of 12 Iowa rivers that were included in a comprehensive review over the past 2 years. The objective of our research was to determine how many of the 12 were appropriate for state designation as a water trail and to develop a broad constituency surrounding each. In Iowa, I should tell you, water trails are not just about paddling. I should say water trails users are not only paddlers and anglers. The Iowa program defines a water trail user as anyone who interacts with the river landscape in any way, and that could include hiking, bird watching, picnicking, camping, you name it, even watching the river from your car. So that's pretty much most people. And water trails in Iowa are also as much about watershed and river restoration and management as they are floating. And one of the things that concerns me with projects such as these is locating a broad representation of interest in the community to participate. And just like every project, there'll be always a passionate few that show up every time and will be very engaged. In this case, it's paddlers and anglers. We can always count on them. But in Iowa, that's a pretty small portion of the population. And so our question today then is how can we build a larger constituency for a river? Okay, next slide. And because we're interested in more than paddling, we're interested in conservation and restoration, we need users that are interested and able to engage at all those different levels. So I'll talk in a very basic sense about public engagement and about what's understood, as well as some conjecture based on my experiences. And I'll talk a little bit about how we've approached this issue in Iowa, and I'll share 4 examples from these 3 rivers. These examples illustrate new knowledge that we developed about the river and about people, and we've used this knowledge to construct a new narrative for the river, if you will, an identity for it. I use the concept, okay, on the next slide, I use the concept identity here to describe essentially the interplay between how we see or consider the river and how it reflects back on us and how it motivates us. In the end, we want to use the identity to bring a strong community together, to engage around the river and to determine its future in their county or region. It's actually an exercise in reframing, even for people who are really familiar with the river itself, such as the paddlers and the anglers. They have some knowledge, but they may not understand the full picture and the meaning of what's present. So let's look at the first example. With each one of these, on the next slide, with each one of these, you'll see a box in the side that has the resources that we used to pull together this information. And I realize that it will be different in every state because not every state has, for example, public archaeology data like we do in Iowa. Next slide. So, but you'll see at least where we started from. So the South Skunk River in Story County, we know from archaeologic investigations, it has a rich history of human use back to 9,000 years of occupation. And we'll start on the next slide with public archaeology data. And these are, this is a presence-absence data set. It shows where archaeologic sites have been identified on a quarter section basis. And when we look at that, we can see that the distribution is throughout the corridor in this part of the county. The next thing that we found was a study that was written, next slide, from an Office of State Archaeologist researcher. He scoured written journals and publications by Euro-American settlers and by early communities as they were developing about Meskwaki use of the river, or of the area. And the Meskwaki are relevant because they were the tribe that was living here at the time of statehood. They still maintain a large settlement in the state today. And this particular researcher geographically located the accounts and then also attributed them to the type of use that was reported by the Euro-Americans. So we can also see that there was historic use of the river by Native Americans as well as prehistoric. So lastly, and this is the pretty exciting part, is we identified a thesis that was written in 2004 from the university. The student mapped, identified the actual locations of a specific type of chert deposit in the bedrock of this river valley. And the chert is important because it was used for the manufacture of tools that have been found throughout the area. And it's the only deposit within this region that could have been the source of these tools. And while some of the sites, they show up on as these small black spots on the map. You can see one really large one down at the bottom, and you can see smaller ones scattered kind of up throughout and some of the tributaries. Some of these sites have been disturbed by construction. Most of them are concealed by sediment, and no one knows that they're even there. One location is commonly used for people who know what it is. They're looking for nodules of the loose material, and that's this part in the very lowest part of the river channel, the bottom. You can see that really thick black line. There are sandbars there where nodules often show up after flood events. So what we know in part is that people were here because of these deposits, because they provided a source of durable material and some of the most durable material that was to be found in the area. So in this sense, bedrock becomes the grounding element, so to speak, of the river's identity. A huge part of the legacy of this place, as people used it prehistorically, was because of these fairly small deposits that set it apart from other rivers. And as an application or a takeaway, which is how, of course, we have to think about all of this work, there are three things that this is useful for. The first is obviously interpretation, that this is valuable information that all kinds of people, from school kids to folks that are in historic organizations, can be excited about, but also permanent protection. Some of these sites are located on public land, but others are not. So the protection, the permanent protection, either through permanent easement or through purchase, is very important. It's a very high priority locally. And third, I think the nodules, the location, the sandbar locations that are on public land, because we are just talking about nodules, and the next slide will show that, an example of one of those nodules. They aren't artifacts per se. They're simply just rocks, and there also can be public events teaching people what this looks like and drawing them into the active nature of using the river for something that's different. So people that don't even paddle. Okay, so the next place I want to take you is the West Nishnabotna River in southwest Iowa, and this is a county that borders on the Missouri River. This is a river that was channelized around 1900 by the use of steam-powered dredges. And on the next slide, we'll see a base map of that. This river, the first somewhat reliable map we have of this site, and any site in Iowa for that matter, this is a historic atlas from 1875. This is the Andreas Atlas. And you have to take all of this with a grain of salt, because it was really maps of this time. The mappers were only required to certify the river location on section lines. So everything else in between that was an interpretation on the mapper's part. And that same principle holds true with the even earlier General Land Office surveys. So we can't say that the river was in this place at this time, but we can say that generally this was the nature or the character of the river at that time. So on the next slide, you'll see an orange line, and this line is the location of the river today. And if you were only looking at those two things, you would say, well, the river has moved quite a bit, but it's kind of got the same character that it always had. And if someone, and in a normal lifetime of a person, this is kind of the frame of reference that we might have. We aren't thinking about the changes that were there before we were born. We're certainly not thinking about necessarily what that river is going to be like 100 years from now. So it became really important for us in this project to be able to use this water recreation trail, the state water trail, to interpret the response from dredging. So we needed to know where the river was on the original dredge line. What was the alignment of it? And those documents may still exist, but we were not able to access them through any county or state government. So we were thinking that we couldn't find them, that they didn't exist at all. And then by chance, and on the next slide you'll see the parcels, the parcel data, we were looking at that. So this is basically land ownership patterns. And as you can see, and on the next slide it'll show it perfectly, I've highlighted it, when the river channel was channelized, they literally redrew the parcel lines to show where the river was. And this is pretty exciting when it comes to mapping and historic research. So now we can see, and so not only is it interesting visually and we can use this to interpret, but we can also do, from a measurement standpoint, we can start to look at variances from the dredge line as well. And when a river like this is channelized, this particular one, the channelization was never maintained, or perhaps it was maintained at the very beginning, but then the dredging line was not maintained. And so right now in this county, it's a free-flowing river with very little manipulation and trying to hold it in place. And so it's, as a water trail, it offers paddlers in Iowa, or whoever comes, this really pretty amazing sense of seeing how a river system is trying to balance itself and how it's still responding and moving and very, in a very dynamic way, responding to the weather and the events that it's presented with today. So the applications for this are basically interpretation, both on the water and off the water. It's about the, the fluvial geomorphology, or the actively changing landform that's being created by the river as a reaction to that channelization 100 years ago. And on one hand, if you were on this river, the banks are very imposing. They're 15 feet high in many places. They're pretty vertical in many places. And you can think about all this movement back and forth, and I'm be kind of curious later to see what you think of all this movement. But you can imagine all the sediment that has washed out, right? And it's all down in the Mississippi River and down in the Delta. And that's one way of looking at it. And the other way, the thing that I would bring to the table also is that remembering when this channel, and when any channel moves laterally or left or right, that it's also building new land. It's building a new active floodplain at that same location. And when if we were to look at an air photo of this site right now, what you would see are massive wetlands that are building on either side of the channel, on the inside bends of the meanders. And so these are full of wetland vegetation, and they're basically unusable for agriculture. So this river, it's not surprising when we start to think about it and we understand the movement of the river and how much has changed, why there is a surprisingly high number of mussel species that live here, and why also there's a high number of breeding birds. So that's a takeaway from that one. I would also put a plug in for this website that shows up on this slide, oldmapsonline.org. If you haven't used it, it's remarkable. You can go anywhere in the world and search at any time period back to, I don't know, 1,000 maybe, the year 1,000, and you can search for whatever maps there are and download them as well for free. And we found maps here that we haven't been able to find anywhere else within the state of Iowa system. And you also have the option of high-resolution downloads that would be suitable for publication if that is what you're interested in, and there's also no cost for that. So historic postcards are a way that we've also been able to find images of rivers and of dredging in this particular case to also sort of excite the local people. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about this same river in another location, the Mormon Trail. This is the Mormon Trail crossing of the West Nishnabotna. And of course, the Mormon Trail was it's a very large migration of people. The trail itself was used by others other than just the Mormon community. And this particular town in southern Potawatomi County, the name of it is Macedonia. And as you might guess from the name, it was named by the Mormon travelers themselves. The West Nishnabotna at the time in the 1800s, 1840s, was surrounded by miles of very wet prairie. The river itself was an indistinct channel. There was an enormous amount of slogging through that had to happen, and crossing was extremely difficult. But this one location near where you see the small white dot, which is actually a water trail access, there was bedrock across the channel. This is the only place in the county, unless you have a super fine geology eye, that you can see exposed bedrock on this river in the county. But at that location was a solid bedrock crossing. So the Mormon travelers stopped here. They created this community of Macedonia, which was actually on the floodplain, much closer to the river originally. And they stayed and actually built houses and had cultivated fields already by the 1840s when the General Land Office survey was done. And so then what happened is this became the place where these trails converged across the river. And on the next slide, you'll see the actual route of the Mormon Trail and also of one other. Oh, okay, so before we get to the trail, let me just show you a couple things. In interpreting Macedonia, working with Macedonia, although there is no formal connection with the church, between the church and the community is very interested in enhancing the visitor experience for people who do retrace this route. And they have all of the normal things in place. They have in the center of the screen near that bend in the road, there's a white dot, and that's where the quintessential rock is located with the plaque. There's also a really beautiful interpretive panel there that describes the Mormon journey. You have a cemetery on the north side of the river. There are actually 2 historic Mormon cemeteries where people were buried. And there are a number of buildings that were somehow moved from the floodplain up to where Macedonia is now located. And those are shown in the community itself. And they're in the process of interpreting that as well. But what's missing here, right? The river is missing. The river is not involved in this story at all, and the river is the basic tenet of this whole story. So we looked at it. So on the next slide, you'll see the actual Mormon Trail. And remembering it's the line to the top or the north. The other one is a road that went to Council Bluffs. And remembering that the river wasn't in its present location today, but it was to the right and somewhere in there. And a lot of that land has now been mined, and the rock is gone. And so it's not as if there's anything remaining. This is also an area that floods very frequently as well. So on the next slide, and this is the last one in the sequence, you'll see 2 small purple shapes. And what we found in field reconnaissance was, because, you know, what's a project if you can't get on a river in that project area for a couple days, right? So we found actually the only piece of bedrock that you really can see, and it's among the local people. It's they didn't know where the bedrock was. They thought it was upstream farther in some very remote place. And in fact, there are smaller pieces of bedrock that you can see upriver a bit, but this really large piece that is completely visible right from that bridge, right from that highway bridge that crosses the river. And also there's a park right across the street. The blue polygon is a county park. The county also owns the land where this outcropping is. And on the top of the river, river right, as it would be. And so what we suggested is that they're very excited about is setting up an interpretation spot on this bedrock area. It's actually quite a high point. There's enough land to have a small parking lot and to do interpretation from here. So it becomes a part of the driving tour that they already have set up. By this way, they can also see the entire river valley. They can see the places where the community used to be, and now they're in a position to have something that is actually, you know, the same bedrock formation that was used for the crossing. The second purple shape that shows up on the Mormon Trail route itself is actually a new river access that we are designing for them. And the Office of State Archaeologist has cleared the site anywhere along this part of the river as having no risk of disturbance of any artifacts, simply because this is a very active fluvial system, and what land is here now was not here then, and what was here then is no longer here. So this will be another place where the interpretation can be, and that it would be actually on relatively speaking, the exact route that it occurred. So the last example, and so, you know, again it's interpretation. Also, what I would say about that last site and the rock, the bedrock, is that rock is what's used as the foundation in all the older buildings in town and all the old houses in town, and it's just been lost. I mean, they lost the even understanding that this resource was there, and that it became a huge part of what this city was. And no discussion from the Midwest would be complete without discussing water quality. And impaired water quality in particular, we get that information from the 303D list. And although on the next slide you'll see a map of the Des Moines River, and this map is illustrated based on the impaired condition or not, and the cause of the impairment. And as designers and planners, we work with data like this every day. We're constantly looking at it, and it's not a surprise to us that the Des Moines River is most of the entire reach of the main channel is impaired for bacteria. But I've yet to present information like this with to local residents, or even sometimes county and municipal government staff, and it's very rare for them to have been aware of this before I mentioned it. And so the bottom two counties in red are the two counties that we were working with in this particular study. And when I showed them this map the first time, I think you can probably imagine what they said. They were like, well, this is all coming at us from the watershed. There's nothing we can do. It's hopeless. We want to throw up our hands, as anyone would be when you see this is a massively large river. So, and then on the next slide, you'll see how I followed that up with them. And I'm showing them Wapello and Van Buren counties, and those are the two that we're working in. And as you can see, there's a number of tributaries right in those counties that are also impaired, that are also contributing to the issue. And so many times it's reframing the issue so that it's very clear that we all have a responsibility, and we all have a contribution to make, and we are all probably contributing to the status of that river, and we're also not in a hopeless situation. So the application here is that when local people become engaged in this, and when people learn about water quality that hadn't thought about it so much in the past, they are able to be a new voice for the soil and water conservation districts in these counties. And not in this particular one, but in a different project area, we've actually been able to get, the Water Trail Steering Group has been able to get the annual plan for that soil and water conservation district to include an element for prioritizing that particular river watershed and water quality in their plan of action. And this is what we think the future is made of. So in summary, on the last slide, which is my summary slide, just using a bit of research and study, and we've attempted to start a new conversation about each one of these rivers, to bond them in place with things that are tangible, that are there now, to really reframe how people perceive a river and what they think they know about it. We've also tried to bring diverse stakeholders together and excite them about protecting and conserving resources that are associated with the river corridor. And in the end, hopefully we're building awareness and engagement from each person who visits it or watches it from their vehicle. Awareness about its condition, its past, and the current issues impacting the system. We're trying to give the river a voice that's inclusive of all aspects of its past and present, and in a way that's woven throughout its corridor. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Mimi. That was really great, and all really cool and unique examples that I found really interesting. So we've got a few questions already in the question and answer box, but I want to at this time again remind you, feel free to ask any other questions that you have in your question box. We've got time for probably 2 questions, given that we're fairly close to the 11:30 mark. So I'll go ahead and ask a couple of them, and then just also a reminder that all of the questions that were asked during the webinar, regardless of whether or not they were asked during this conversation, will be available on the Blue Trails Guide website, bluetrailsguide.org/blogs, on the same day as the webinar, the recorded webinar will be released, which is Monday, February 22nd. So, Mimi, one of the questions that we have is in reference to your comment at the end where you talk specifically about working with communities. So how do you communicate this data and the information that you're finding to local community members and stakeholders? Are they a part of the process? Is it something that you talk with about them afterwards? What sort of is the people component?
That's a great question. Thanks a lot, Faye. The way we've done it that has been successful has been that the local constituents are involved in the process all along, and so about the time it becomes appropriate is when we've just about finished data collection and we understand what we're beginning to find in terms of resources and history that's present. We are very careful to build a very diverse steering group that is representative of all the different constituencies that might be present. And I'd be glad to share a sample of what those organizations or interests look like. It does vary with river to river. And then we rely on a pretty cohesive steering group process, and those people communicating with their own subgroups within the community. And a very close alignment with the county sponsors for this work. And then in the end, a public meeting where this material is sort of unveiled publicly. And then in the future, interpretation plans and water trail development elements that support moving this thing forward. So my job is to get it started and to set up a process that's functional and stable for the long term. And then it's off onto the local folks to complete the project or to continue to work on it.
Great, thanks, Amy. One final question is relating back to the data that you've talked about. So how do you determine what data your community will use?
I try to find and people who work with me know, I try to find every piece of data that's available for a river. And sometimes it's obscure and hard to find, but I think if it's valid data, it's accurate, that we understand its limitations, that it's all important because it all comes together to tell you the story. For example, the South Skunk archaeologic example, if we'd only had one of those pieces, that would have been interesting, but not really exciting. But the more that we were able to get that told, the more pieces we were able to get put together a much broader story and a much richer story. And that's the thing that can really drive a lot of engagement and excitement.
That's great. Thanks so much, Mimi. Seeing that we're a couple of minutes over and being mindful of everybody's busy schedule, I think we will close the questions off at that point. But again, all of the questions will be available on the Blue Trails Guide website early next week, so stay tuned for that. As always, I'll send a recap email out with the recorded webinar information, so please feel free to view the webinar again or share it with any colleagues or members of staff that you work with that would find this webinar interesting. I want to thank everybody again for joining us today, and especially Mimi, a big thanks to you for taking time to give us a ton of really helpful and super interesting information about your work. I look forward to seeing everybody again next month for our monthly webinar series in March. Have a great rest of your February, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks so much.